Hello, this is Matt Singer. I'm the Arts and Culture Editor at Willamette Week, and today I am speaking with Professor John Ott. He is a professor of medieval European history at Portland State University, and he just finished teaching a quarter on I'm going to give sort of like the layman's uh, uh, description of what he just got done teaching a class on, and he can probably go into more appropriate details on what this is, but it's effectively a 500-year-old treatise on that at least includes in part a guide to witch hunting, which is obviously appropriate for the season. So, John, maybe we can start by first, giving more historically appropriate context for what this book is and how PSU actually acquired it.
Sure, be happy to. So about 2 years ago, Portland State University's Special Collections in the library acquired a 500-year-old codex, the contents of which were printed in 1490. We purchased it from a Parisian bookseller after having gone on the old and antiquarian book market, specifically looking for a early printed book that we could use as the basis of a research practicum for Portland State undergraduates and graduate students. And we came upon this particular codex, which binds together two completely separate texts that were published by two different printers in the late 15th century. The first of the texts is known as a world chronicle. It is a history of the world from creation in the Christian tradition of creation down to the present, which in this case is 1484. So it covers the history of the world from the beginning to 1484. And this was the most widely printed and best known world chronicle of the 15th century. It was initially written by a 15th century monk and went through dozens and dozens of reprinting. So it was very widely available, very popular work. The second text in the codex is by far the better known of the two, and it is a late 15th century witch hunting treatise called the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches. And it was written by two inquisitors, one of whom had extensive and direct experience prosecuting accused witches in trials, and who wrote the majority of the text. It was co-authored, but the inquisitor with practical experience was the one who wrote the majority of it, but he wrote it to serve as a guide for his fellow inquisitors in identifying and successfully bringing to trial and successfully prosecuting accused witches.
So can you kind of put into context for me, like how rare is something like this, or at least this particular codex? Like, is this like what's like the level of rarity we're dealing with?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a book like this, that is to say, a codex which contains two separate texts bound together is really incredibly rare. 15th century printed matter is usually found in libraries or in museums or sometimes in private collections. So you're not going to stumble across a book like this from the early period of print, the first 50 or so years of print. The Malleus Maleficarum, the witch hunting treatise, is a second edition. And a typical edition in this time would have printed roughly 400, maybe 500 copies of a work. And so over time, dozens, if not hundreds of these have been lost. But right now, there are several dozen, maybe more, libraries around the world that hold second editions. In the United States, we're probably one of maybe 20 or fewer institutions that have a Malleus Maleficarum of this antiquity.
What is the historical reality of witches? I mean, people, like you said, sort of thought they were everywhere. I mean, but what actually were witches when we look back? Like, what's the explanation for why they thought witches were everywhere?
Yeah, that's a really great and complicated question. There are a couple of different realities here, and historians have long asked themselves, were there actual witches? Were there people who actually believed that they were practicing the sorts of magic that were attributed to the idea of the witch? And the answer to that question is a resounding no. There's literally no independent evidence that individuals performed the kinds of magic, and that magic had a very specific set of characteristics. It intentionally sought to do harm to livestock, to crops. It curdled or poisoned milk. A big part of that myth was that witches actively killed babies. And consequently, midwives were often associated with witches or sorceresses because of their proximity to childbirth. And so in the event of tragic deaths or stillborn deaths, they were thought to have been agents of Satan who carried them out. So this whole notion, the myth of the witch, the kind of archetype that develops in large measure due to the Malleus Maleficarum, which really cements and solidifies it. That is a mythical figure who nevertheless the inquisitors genuinely believed existed, and who was the sort of diabolical conspiratorial force that was trying to undermine Christian society. There was undoubtedly, or there were individuals who practiced and believed they were practicing their own magics. And magic is an extraordinarily diverse and multifaceted arena in which humans try through various means to channel natural forces to bring about various ends. And this has a long and ancient pre-Christian tradition behind it, a folk tradition. And what we would call probably types of folk magic were undoubtedly practiced here and there by women and some men, particularly in rural areas.
So what does it say, if you could summarize in terms of hunting witches or bringing them to trial? Like, what is the actual, like, what are some of the actual bits of advice that are found in this?
Well, yeah, it's written in 3 parts, and after a kind of an introduction, which gives a kind of intellectual and theological argument for the existence of witches, it then offers in the middle part, which is quite long, a variety of examples of what witches get up to. So all the things I mentioned before, the kinds of conduct and activity. And this was, it's important to note just how feminized the archetype of the witch is. The witch is a woman by and large, and consequently, a lot of the magic attributed to her centers around activities with which women were associated. So childbirth, the household, domestic life, domestic activities. And so the second part of the book contains examples of witches sort of engaging in horrible sorts of things, from killing children and livestock to poisoning food supplies. There are examples as well about what demons get up to. So the whole thing the whole second part of the book revolves around stories like that. And some of the more sort of infamous and tawdry of those have to do with witches making male genitalia disappear. There's a sort of some historians have speculated as a kind of underlying fear of male castration evident in these stories of disappearing penises, and actually witches harvesting them and keeping them alive. So if people know a story from the Malleus, it's usually something along those lines. And then the third part has to do with judicial procedure, how you interrogate a witch once you have one in your court. And the logic here is really quite ingenious, but also quite frightening, because the witch, by definition, who is in league with Satan, is going to lie, is in effect a hostile witness, cannot be counted upon to render the truth. And so torture then becomes a necessary implement by which to extract a confession from a suspected witch. And so the treatise goes into the various ways in which witches try to deceive the judge, and then the techniques to get around those deceptions. And one of the ways they will deceive, even in the face of torture, even in the midst of torture, is that they will cast spells so that they cannot feel pain. So if we think about that for a second, right? A woman, an innocent woman, accused of witchcraft, who refuses to confess to doing something she did not do, and endures the physical suffering of torture, is understood in this logic to simply be carrying out a witch's spell, which inures her, sort of insulates her from feeling pain. So the treatise's real sort of meat and interest for other theologians was in all the examples of what witches get up to, what they do, and then how you go about prosecuting them.